It was the day I had been dreaming of since I was a little girl, flipping through bridal magazines and fantasizing about the perfect wedding. The day had finally come, and as I stood in the bridal suite, staring at myself in the full-length mirror, my heart swelled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. I was wrapped in an ivory gown that hugged my curves delicately, its intricate lace patterns running down to the flowing train. My veil was pinned back, and I felt like I was floating in a dream. My bridesmaids, Clara and Emily, both lifelong friends, were buzzing around me, helping with last-minute touch-ups. "Wow! Sophia, you look absolutely stunning," Clara exclaimed, her eyes lighting up as she placed the finishing touches on my makeup. "Thank you," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't believe this is actually happening." Emily carefully handed me my bouquet, a mix of white roses and baby's breath. "Here you go, Soph." My father walked into the room, and his eyes immediately welled up. "You look beautiful, sweetheart. Mark is a lucky man." "Thank you, Daddy," I whispered, my own eyes misty. I looped my arm through his as we prepared to walk down the aisle. The music began to play. The classic "Here Comes the Bride." My heart pounded as the doors swung open, revealing the elegantly decorated chapel, awash with the light from crystal chandeliers and flickering candeliers and flickering candles. Our closest friends and family turned in their seats to watch me, their faces glowing with smiles and happy tears. And there, at the end of the aisle, stood Mark. He looked dapper in his tailored black tuxedo, but something was off. As I glided towards him, his expression remained flat, devoid of the enthusiasm I had expected. Instead of a loving gaze, I was met with eyes that seemed distant, even a little troubled. We reached the altar, and I felt my father squeeze my arm reassuringly before letting go. Mark took my hands, but his touch was colder than I had ever felt before. "Is everything all right?" I whispered, looking up at him. "It's just the excitement, Soph," he replied, his voice low. "Just pre-wedding jitters. You know how it is." I nodded, unconvinced, but unwilling to tarnish our ceremony with doubts. Our officiant, a kind, middle-aged woman named Pastor Lisa, began to speak, filling the chapel with words about love, commitment, and the sacred vows we were about to take. But all I could think about was the disconnect I felt from Mark. Was it just cold feet, or was it a sign of something deeper? Finally, the moment arrived for us to recite our vows. "I, Sophia, take you, Mark, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part," I declared, pouring every ounce of love and commitment into each word, hoping to bridge the emotional gap between us. "I, Mark, take you, Sophia, to be my wedded wife," he recited back mechanically, not missing a word, but also not adding any warmth to them. We exchanged rings, sealed our vows with a kiss, and turned to face our loved ones. Their applause filled the room, but it couldn't fill the growing void inside me. Something wasn't right, and as we made our way back down the aisle, the man next to me felt like a stranger, even though I had just vowed to spend the rest of my life with him. In the midst of the celebration, confetti and flowers, I couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that I had just made a colossal mistake. But the rings were exchanged, the vows spoken, and the marriage certificate signed. This was supposed to be the start of our happily ever after, yet it felt like anything but a new beginning. After a whirlwind honeymoon that involved sunsets on beaches and romantic dinners in candlelit restaurants, we returned to the reality of everyday life. We moved into my house, a warm, comfortable space I'd bought before meeting Mark. The early days seemed almost idyllic. We unpacked our wedding gifts, placing them around the home to fill it with new memories. I went back to work at my high-profile job while Mark was still in the middle of job hunting. During the first weeks, we fell into a comfortable routine. I would come home to the smell of freshly cooked meals as Mark took it upon himself to be the resident chef until he found a job. How was work? He would ask as I entered the house, taking my coat and giving me a soft peck on the cheek. Busy as always, but nothing I can't handle. I would reply, my tired eyes lighting up at the sight of him and the dinner table set for two. We'd share our days over meals, watch TV shows together, and make plans for the weekends. Mark would often talk excitedly about job interviews and potential opportunities. Everything seemed perfect, like a puzzle that had all the right pieces. But as the weeks rolled into months, I noticed subtle changes. The dinners became less frequent, replaced by takeout boxes and reheated leftovers. Mark's daily routines seemed to dissolve into an odd mix of sleeping in and aimless surfing on the internet. And the worst part, the drinking started. At first it was just a beer or two in the evenings, but it gradually escalated into bottles of hard liquor, guzzled down like water. It came to a head one evening when I returned home after a grueling 12-hour workday to find Mark sprawled on the couch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. "Mark, we need to talk," I said, my voice tinged with both concern and irritation. "Yeah, about what?" He looked up, his eyes clouded and unfocused. "About this," I said, gesturing to the alcohol-littered coffee table. "You've been drinking way too much lately, and you're not even looking for a job anymore. What's going on?" "Ah, so now you're my mother, keeping tabs on me," he retorted, the slurred words dripping with sarcasm. "No, I'm your wife, the woman who pledged to spend her life with you. And if something's wrong, we should be able to talk about it. Maybe if you were less obsessed with your fancy job, you'd realize that I have my own struggles," he snapped back, his voice rising. I stood there, stunned. This wasn't the Mark I had married. The Mark I knew was caring and ambitious, full of love and life. This version was a stranger, a lazy, bitter man who drowned his sorrows in alcohol instead of facing them. "That's no excuse, Mark," I finally replied, my own voice quivering with suppressed emotion. "We all have struggles, but we don't sabotage ourselves or the people we love. That's not fair to either of us." He stared at me for a moment before turning his gaze back to the TV, effectively ending the conversation. I retreated to our bedroom, my mind a whirlpool of confusion and dread. How did we go from newlywed bliss to this nightmarish reality? What happened to the dream we both had for our life together? As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt a hollow emptiness engulf me. It was becoming increasingly clear that the dream I had envisioned was shattering, replaced by a harsh reality I had neither expected nor prepared for. And as the days went on, that reality would prove to be harsher than I could have ever imagined. The subsequent weeks were like walking on a tightrope, each day fraught with the dread of an impending fall. I buried myself in work, taking on extra projects just for the sake of staying away from the home that had started to feel more like a battlefield. Meanwhile, Mark became an enigma, his moods swinging unpredictably between silent resentment and explosive outbursts. One evening, I decided I'd had enough of the tension. I came home earlier than usual, groceries in hand, with plans to cook a nice dinner for both of us, a small attempt to bridge the widening gap between us, to remind us both of the simpler, happier times. "Mark, I'm home," I called out as I stepped through the front door. No response. I found him in the living room, eyes glued to the TV screen and another bottle of liquor by his side. "Mark, can we please talk? Maybe over dinner." I bought some stuff to make lasagna. "Your favorite," I offered, my voice laced with cautious optimism. "Ah." So now you're playing the doting wife. A bit late for that. Don't you think? He sneered without even looking at me. I was taken aback. I don't understand. I'm trying to make things better between us. Why are you acting like this? Because, Sophia, not everything is as picture perfect as you want it to be. You go about your high-flying job while I'm stuck here, jobless and aimless. Do you think that's easy for me? His voice was a caustic mix of self-pity and bitterness. Then do something about it, Mark. Apply for jobs, go out, meet people. Do anything other than sit here drowning in alcohol and self-loathing. I fired back, my own frustrations bubbling to the surface. He stood up abruptly, towering over me. You have no idea what it's like, Sophia. And maybe it's time you stop pretending that you do. With that, he stomped out of the room, leaving me standing there, dumbfounded and hurt. I slumped into a chair, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. Our marriage had become an abyss that kept growing, and no matter how hard I tried to bridge it, Mark seemed determined to make it wider. I made the lasagna anyway, a mechanical process that gave me some time to think. As I layered the pasta sheets, I couldn't help but reflect on the layers of mistrust and resentment that had built up between us. By the time the dish was in the oven, I felt emotionally spent, cooked down to my barest elements, much like the ingredients in the lasagna. Dinner was a silent affair. Mark ate without a word, his face expressionless. There was no praise for the food, no casual conversation, only the chasm of silence that had become our uninvited dinner guest. That night, as I lay in bed beside a man who now felt like a stranger, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change, something drastic. I didn't yet know what form that change would take, but as I closed my eyes, I felt a grim resolve settle over me. Unbeknownst to me, Mark had plans of his own, plans that would force me into a terrifying ordeal and irrevocably shatter the illusion of our marriage. But as I drifted off to sleep, all I felt was a strange sense of calm, as though I was standing on the edge of that abyss, ready to leap into the unknown. The tension had escalated to a point where I felt physically stifled. The moment I walked into my own home, I had begun to count down the minutes during my commute, each second filling me with an unsettling mix of dread and resignation. It was on a Friday evening when Mark, out of nowhere, suggested that we go for a picnic in the woods the next day. The idea struck me as odd. We hadn't done anything together in months, let alone something as intimate as a picnic. Really. A picnic? I looked at him incredulously, searching his face for some clue to this sudden change. Yeah, why not? We both could use some fresh air, don't you think? He looked back at me, but there was a guarded quality to his eyes that I couldn't decipher. All right, if you think it'll be good for us, I agreed, still puzzled but secretly hopeful that maybe this would be the turning point we so desperately needed. The following day, we drove to the forest. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't shake off a growing sense of unease, but I pushed it aside, telling myself that I was being overly paranoid. We reached a secluded spot that seemed ideal for a picnic. Just as I started to feel a glimmer of optimism, Mark abruptly stopped the car and turned off the engine. "We're here," he announced, his voice void of emotion. The next moment, we were at each other's throats. The catalyst was something trivial. I don't even remember what it was, but it quickly escalated, fueled by months of pent-up resentment and disappointment. "I can't believe I ever marry you!" Mark screamed, his face flushed red with anger. "Well, the feeling is mutual," I shot back, equally enraged. "Get out!" he suddenly spat out, pointing toward the car door. "What? Get out of the car, Sophia. You can't be serious. We're in the middle of the forest, for God's sake. I don't care. Get out. Before I could fully grasp what was happening, Mark had unbuckled his seatbelt, stormed out of the car, and was pulling open my door. Before I knew it, I was being dragged out and found myself standing alone as the car sped away, its tires crunching over the gravel until the sound was swallowed by the distance. I stood there, paralyzed by disbelief and shock. How had we reached this point? What kind of man abandons his wife in the middle of nowhere? As I took a step forward to chase after the car, my foot slipped, and I tumbled down a steep hill, losing consciousness as I hit the ground. When I woke up, it was dusk. My arm throbbed in pain, clearly broken or at least severely injured. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and stumbled through the dark woods, guided only by the moonlight filtering through the canopy of trees. Hours later, I found myself on a road where a kind truck driver picked me up and took me to the hospital. As I sat in the truck, speeding away from the dark woods and the dreadful day that had left me broken, both physically and emotionally, I knew one thing for certain. I needed to get out of this abyss of a marriage, and Mark would have to face the consequences of his unforgivable actions. I was still reeling from the shock and the physical pain, but another sensation was beginning to take hold, a burning desire for justice, for reclaiming my dignity, and yes, for revenge. And so, as I lay in the hospital bed that night, waiting for the doctors to set my fractured arm, I began to plot. I knew the road ahead would be grueling, but I was ready. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. Mark had pushed me into an abyss, but he had also given me something invaluable. A reason to fight, and fight I would. I spent a week in the hospital, nursing my broken arm and a heart filled with newfound resolve. Friends came by, offering support, and I was touched by their gestures. But my mind was elsewhere, planning, strategizing, preparing for the fight that lay ahead. The first step was the hardest. With my arm still in a cast, I went straight to the police station from the hospital. I felt vulnerability accentuated by the sterile smell of the precinct and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. But I knew I had to do this. "Please, have a seat, Mrs." Sophia, the officer, guided me into a chair. As I recounted the events, from the insidious deterioration of our marriage to the terrifying incident in the forest, the officer listened intently, taking notes. I knew it would be my word against Mark's, and I was determined to make my word count. "So you're saying he intentionally left you in the middle of nowhere?" The officer looked up, skepticism painting his features. "Yes, and I broke my arm because of it." "I have the medical records and my doctors are willing to testify," I asserted, matching his gaze. "We'll need those, and we'll have to bring your husband in for questioning." "I understand." I nodded, steeling myself for what was about to unfold. That very evening, Mark was taken into custody. His reaction was one of shock and disbelief, unable to comprehend how his so-called submissive wife had turned the tables. "Are you insane, Sophia? Do you really think anyone would believe you?" He hissed at me when we crossed paths at the station. "I don't need them to believe me, Mark. I have proof, and I have the law on my side," I retorted, locking eyes with him. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations, court hearings, and countless therapy sessions. My colleagues were supportive, offering to cover for me when I had to make court appearances. And as the trial date approached, I felt a mix of dread and anticipation. "I've reviewed your case, Sophia. It's strong, but it'll come down to how well you can present yourself. You need to make the jury see the truth," my lawyer advised during one of our sessions. And how do I do that? By being honest, but also by being strong. You've been through a traumatic experience. The jury needs to see both the vulnerability and the strength that comes from surviving something like that. As I stepped into the courtroom on the day of the trial, my heart pounding in my chest, I thought of all the trials that had led me to this point, the emotional trials of a failing marriage, the physical trial of surviving the forest ordeal, and the endless legal trials that paved the way for this moment. With every question posed by the lawyers, every objection raised, and every statement made, I could feel the weight of the jury's eyes on me. But I remained steadfast, recounting my ordeal with clarity and conviction. And then the day of reckoning arrived. The jury found Mark guilty, sentencing him to 5 years in prison for aggravated assault and abandonment. As the judge hammered the gavel, marking the end of the trial and a chapter in my life, I felt a mix of relief and triumph. I had walked the tightrope and survived the abyss. Mark would pay for what he had done. But this was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life and my dignity. As I left the courtroom, a free woman in more ways than one, I knew that the fight for survival had been worth it. The abyss still existed, but I was no longer teetering on its edge. I was on solid ground, ready for whatever came next. The dust had settled, but my journey wasn't over. Seeing Mark in handcuffs and listening to his sentence being read out in court was satisfying, but it was also just the beginning of a long, challenging road to healing and justice. The trial was a milestone, but it was far from the endgame. I still had to contend with the web of lies and deceit he had spun around our lives, a web that extended beyond just him and me. Mark had drained our joint accounts, leaving me financially crippled. During our marriage, I had also signed over the deed of my house to both our names in the spirit of marital unity. He could use this as a bargaining chip from behind bars, complicating my divorce and asset division process. I've looked into the paperwork, Sophia. We might be able to claim that you were coerced into adding his name to the deed, especially considering the pattern of abuse my lawyer Sarah informed me during one of our consultations. How solid is that argument in court? I asked, anxious about another legal hurdle. It's not a guarantee, but given the circumstances and his recent conviction, it strengthens your case, she responded. While discussing these options with Sarah, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Anna, an old college friend who also happened to work in cybersecurity. Hey, Sophie, I've heard about what happened. If you need any help with financials, like tracking down hidden accounts or assets, I'm here, the message read. Anna's offer was a ray of light. Sarah, what if we could prove that Mark has hidden assets, that he's not as financially helpless as he claims to be? That could significantly influence the division of assets, and maybe even result in further legal consequences for him. But we'd need concrete evidence. With a plan formulating in my mind, I left Sarah's office and met up with Anna. As we sat down with our laptops, cups of coffee beside us, the atmosphere was thick with determination. I can't do anything illegal, Sophia, but I can help you monitor activity, maybe find something useful, Anna clarified before we began. I understand. I appreciate your help, I said gratefully. For hours, we pored over financial records, transactions, and even dived into the darker corners of the internet. Eventually, we stumbled upon a series of offshore accounts linked to a shell company. With Anna's expertise, we traced it back to Mark. Gotcha! Anna smirked as she connected the dots. Armed with this newfound information, I felt empowered. Mark thought he could bend the system to his whims, even from a jail cell. But he had underestimated me yet again. Just as I had plotted his legal downfall, I was ready to unravel his financial duplicity. Sarah was ecstatic when I presented her with the evidence. This is gold, Sophia. With this, we can not only secure your assets, but potentially charge him with financial fraud. Our next court appearance was another thunderous victory. The evidence of hidden assets worked like a charm. The judge ruled in favor of nullifying Mark's name from the house deed and freezing the offshore accounts, pending a financial fraud investigation. "Looks like the tables have turned," Sarah said, a triumphant smile on her face as we left the courtroom. "Yes, but the game isn't over yet," I replied, my eyes focused on the horizon. Mark had fallen into his own trap, one originally designed to ensnare me. But the real victory wasn't just in reclaiming my house or securing financial justice. It was in plotting my way through a maze of deception, coming out stronger and smarter. And so, with my house to myself and justice served, my plotting stage came to an end. But my story was far from over. There was still healing to be done, peace to be found, and a life to be rebuilt. I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it head on. The courtroom had become a familiar battleground, its wooden pews and high ceilings witnesses to my fight for justice. But this time, I wasn't just here for myself. I was here to make sure Mark paid for the full extent of his transgressions. We were back for a different kind of hearing, one focusing on financial fraud. Mark had somehow managed to hire a defense attorney, likely using money from the very accounts he was being accused of hiding. "You're still pushing this, Sophia? Haven't you done enough?" Mark sneered as we waited for the judge to arrive. "I'll stop when justice is fully served," I retorted, staring right back at him. "You can't touch me. They have no proof." "Oh, but I think they do," I smiled, my eyes never leaving his. The judge entered, and the room hushed. We presented our case, meticulously laying out every detail of Mark's elaborate financial scheme. Anna had helped me collect even more evidence, working late into the nights to ensure no stone was left unturned. In light of the overwhelming evidence, this court finds the defendant guilty of financial fraud, the judge announced. Sentencing will be carried out immediately. Mark, you are hereby sentenced to an additional 2 years in prison and ordered to return all assets to Sophia. As the judge hammered the gavel, I felt a rush of euphoria wash over me. This was it, my moment of ultimate triumph. I had won, not through vengeance, but through the strength of my will, my resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. "Was it worth it, Sophia?" Mark growled as the officers prepared to take him away. "Was ruining my life worth it?" "You ruined your own life, Mark," I responded, my voice unwavering. As I exited the courtroom, my friends and supporters surrounded me, showering me with congratulatory hugs and praises. But for me, the real victory lay in something far more profound. I had reclaimed my agency, my dignity, and my life. I was no longer Sophia, the victim. I was Sophia, the survivor, and it felt incredibly liberating. My lawyer, Sarah, came over to me with a big smile. "You did it, Sophia. Not only did you get justice, but you also got your life back." "Thank you, Sarah, for standing by me," I said, tears of relief and happiness in my eyes. "It was my honor." "So what's next for Sophia?" she asked. "Rebuilding," I said, "and living." The story didn't end with the judge's gavel or Mark's resentful glares. It continued as I walked out of the courtroom, my head held high and my spirit untamed. Revenge had been exacted, not through underhanded schemes or brute force, but through the power of truth and the justice system. It was the most satisfying form of revenge, one that didn't just punish Mark, but liberated me. As I drove back to my home, one that was now truly mine in every sense, I thought about the journey that had led me here. I had endured pain, betrayal, and heartbreak. But I had also found strength, resilience, and a profound sense of self-worth. I had lost the man I thought I loved, but found the woman I was truly meant to be. Revenge, as they say, is a dish best served cold. But perhaps justice is an even better one, served with a side of reclaimed freedom and a renewed sense of self. And so, as I closed the door behind me, stepping into the next chapter of my life, I knew one thing for sure. This was not the end, but a new beginning. And this time, I was the author of my own